Thank you very much, Max. And hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. As Max said, I'm Sarah, and I head up the sustainability team at Benchmark. With the 4 minutes in mind, I'll jump kind of straight into what I'm here to talk about today. And then I can always kind of talk more around myself and Benchmark in the 4 minutes following that. So we can come back to this, but to kind of kick things off and like you say, Max, to set the scene of today's webinar, I just wanted to start with an overview of kind of where we're at in terms of battery cell demand and where we see things going. So no surprise in that we're expecting significant growth in global cell demand over the coming decade. Here, looking at that projected growth, and also looking at it by end use market. So really what we see is from 2025 to 2035, we're forecasting an over fourfold growth in battery demand, with the majority of that deriving from the EV market. However, we're seeing increasing proportions of demand from battery energy storage systems as well. We're seeing China representing significant portions of this demand, though Europe also, of course, increasingly representing significant proportions itself as well. But really, I think when we start to dig into this story of the supply chain and what it means, and from that perspective, what that really means is the growth in demand downstream is being felt upstream, particularly, as we say, around those critical minerals. So here I've just focused on some of the key cathode materials, looking at lithium, nickel, and cobalt market balances from today out to 2040. And of course, in order to meet the demand at cell level, we need to be feeding these plants with the materials needed. Hence why I thought this is just a very useful visualization to understand what this means for the upstream. And so what we can see across these markets is that within the next decade, a bit closer for some of the materials, slightly further away for some of the others, is that we will be seeing clear calls for additional material in order to meet this battery demand. And what we really see here is that mining will be a bottleneck for meeting demand at battery level. Of course, here, just for kind of context, I suppose, the numbers that I'm presenting are taking into consideration new sources of supply, whether that be regionally or indeed new technologies. And crucially, it's also including what we're forecasting as secondary supply, so the materials recovered from recycling. And to dig into recycling in a bit more detail, particularly in the European context, what we can see is that recycling is increasingly going to play become an opportunity for Europe. So on the left-hand side here, I've got a chart looking at forecast growth in battery recycling feedstock within Europe for today in 2025 and in 2035. So this is in gigawatt hours, but ultimately what we see here is that in the next 10 years, we're expecting an over 12 times growth in this pool, signifying that opportunity for the region. So that's an opportunity to move towards a more circular economy, strengthen supply independence, and of course, retain economic value from these materials. Really, though, when we look at that significant growth in feedstock, what we're also looking at is a significant investment required to really be able to meet the demand of this material being recycled, put back into cathode materials suitable for going back into the supply chain. And so one other chart that I really wanted to show here was kind of speaking to some of the complexity there. So this chart is looking at the market balance for European recycling capacity in terms of pre-treatment capacity, which is essentially taking in end-of-life batteries and production scrap and converting it to an intermediate product such as black mass, and then the refining capacity, so feeding in that black mass and producing battery materials. And so what we see is that in Europe at the moment, we are at an overcapacity in terms of pre-treatment, but really lacking in that refining capacity. So feeding plants with black mass and producing battery materials. And so as a result, a lot of that black mass is leaking out of the region and flowing towards Asia. This year, we have seen steps by the European government to kind of use policies and means to address this issue. However, we are still seeing this kind of trend carrying on. So I'm aware that that was a quick 4 minutes, but something to kind of set the scene in terms of understanding where we're at in terms of demand, where we're at critically with the critical materials and the recycling side of things is always something I find particularly interesting. But with that, I'll come back to the group and hopefully we can embark on a 4 minute discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much and nicely on time. So are there already questions from the audience? Just the best way is to raise your hand or just unmute your microphone and ask your question. Otherwise, let me start with the first question. If you take into account what you showed us, and if you take into account though, if we would recycle everything we have in Europe, is there still like a material which is most critical, or we might not be able to cover with like recycling at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way that we're kind of looking at recycling and therefore secondary supply in our models is we look at the volume of kind of EVs and portables and all the batteries that are deployed to market today. We apply a series of assumptions around, their lifespan, what proportion of them could go into secondary kind of applications, so into the reuse market, which is a whole other thing, which is really interesting. And so we apply those assumptions, we look at collection rates, which is a huge kind of part of the logistics conversation around the recycling market. And what we have calculated, kind of best case scenario in 2040, so still quite a long time away, around a quarter of lithium demand and about a third of lithium and cobalt demand could be by recycling. Now, that's kind of a base case. There's a more optimistic outlook. There's a slightly more pessimistic outlook. But I think really what it demonstrates is that recycling is definitely something we should be doing. There are targets in terms of policy targets to be met. And from a circularity perspective, it's absolutely fundamental. And it also can help meet the supply needs. However, the reality is that we are going to have to be mining for the foreseeable to kind of get to the stage where there's enough material out of the ground to recycle further down the line.
Thank you very much. I don't see a question from the audience, so maybe let me continue with a short last question, well, because we already reached our time limit. What's your call of action? Like, what are you looking for?
In terms of in the battery space, I mean, I think there would be a lot of kind of different calls to action. So my specific role at Benchmark is to head up our sustainability research. That's where we're looking at all stages of the battery supply chain from mine to grid. And a key part of this is engaging with stakeholders that sit all around the supply chain at different stages with different perspectives to really understand kind of the key environment, social and governance risks and opportunities that are specific to different materials and different markets. And speaking to those stakeholders is a really kind of key part of our methodology that informs the data and intelligence that we produce. So I think one call from me would be, if you have a perspective that you'd like to share when it comes to the sustainability and kind of social side of what we're all working on within the battery supply chain, please do reach out, and I'd love to kind of involve you in some of those stakeholder conversations.
Right.